Howdy, everybody. It's Randy Ray at the Literate Texan. Welcome back to Driftwood Ranch. Tonight, I have another bookshelf tour for you. I'm still on bookcase number 1. This is shelf number 3, and there's a lot of books on this shelf. So I'm going to talk about them as I go through them with you. And I think certain people will really enjoy this particular bookshelf tour, but I'm not going to mention any names. But if you've been a part of this little corner of BookTube for long, you'll know who I'm talking about. But the first book that I'm going to look at here is a mass market paperback of Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. This was the National Book Award winner, and it is a war book, and it's about a man who is seriously injured during, I don't remember if it was World War I or World War II. I believe it was World War I. But at any rate, it's a profoundly disturbing novel, and it illustrates the horrors of war probably about as well as anything I've ever read. I don't know that I would call it a pleasant reading experience. It certainly wasn't very much fun, but it's probably worth reading if you've a mind for that and stuff. So that brown thing wiggling around behind me is my dog, by the way. Okay, so that's the first book on the shelf. The next book on the shelf is actually not a book at all. It's the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the Winter 2024 issue. And I don't know if you've ever seen these before or not, but they're digest-sized, basically paperback books, collections of short stories and stuff about fantasy and science fiction. I got my first issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1982 when I was 12 years old. My mom bought me a subscription to it, and it's changed a little since then, but I bought a lifetime subscription when lifetime subscriptions were available, so I'll continue to get this for the rest of my life. One way the modern world has changed and improved, by the way, is the labels on the back, the mailing label. They used to put it on the front. It's almost impossible to remove without damaging your magazine here. But this is the 75th year of publication is what it says in here. So there's a novelette. There's a whole mess of short stories listed in here. There's poems. There's 4 poems. And then there's departments. The departments are often the most interesting part to me. Charles DeLint writes a column called Books to Look For, and has for years and years. And his selections, his curation of recommended fantasy books, always really good. But there's a science column in here. There's another book review section. There's a television section. There's not a movie review in this particular issue, which is too bad. But I'm old enough to remember when the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction had a science column every issue from Isaac Asimov, and he had a really long run of providing those there. And I can also remember when Harlan Ellison was the movie critic for the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And the name of his column then was Harlan Ellison's Watching, which was also the name of the book that collected those. So anyway, I got a whole mess of these fantasy and science fiction magazines around here. That one just happens to be misshelved. I've got a room with a bookshelf that's devoted to nothing else but those. Okay, so next we've got the Penguin Classic Edition of Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House, which I meant to read for Horror Mayhem and didn't get to. But this is a good book. This is one of the quintessential haunted house books that you'll ever read. I do intensely dislike the little Netflix insignia up there. And no, you can't peel it off. It's printed right there on that. And I've seen several people point out how irritating that is. Also, I should point out that the first line of this novel is really, really good, and I'm going to read it to you, although you've probably heard it before. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. That's terrific. That whole paragraph's terrific. So this is obviously an eclectic bookshelf. This next book is called God, a Biography, which won the Pulitzer Prize, written by Jack Miles. If I'm not mistaken, he's a Jesuit priest, or was at least educated by a Jesuit priest. I'll read you the back of it. I haven't read this book yet. What sort of a person is God? What is his life story? Is it possible to approach him not as an object of religious reverence, but as the protagonist of the world's greatest book, as a character who possesses all the depths, contradictions, and ambiguities of a Hamlet? This is the task that Jack Miles, a former Jesuit trained in religious studies and Near Eastern language, accomplishes with such brilliance and originality in God, a biography. So this looks interesting to me. I'm looking forward to reading it. Don't know when I'll get to it, but I'm looking forward to reading it. Okay, another Penguin classic that I've got here is Things Fall Apart. And I'm going to mangle the pronunciation of the name, but it's by Chinua Achebe. 1958 novel. It's set in Africa. It is the first of 3 novels in the author's African trilogy. And by all accounts, this is a really great book. Haven't read it, but I have it. Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Okay, so next, this is an odd choice. I told you this is going to be a very eclectic set of books. The 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade. The 120 Days of Sodom. I haven't read this yet, but I understand that it's, well, let's just say it's in poor taste, and it would just move on from there. But when I do read it, if I've got anything to say about it, you'll find out about it here on this channel. Next up, Psychic Blues, Confessions of a Conflicted Medium by Mark Edward. Psychic Blues by Mark Edward. Okay, so I read this, I guess about 14, 15 months ago. I like memoirs, and I especially like memoirs written by people who do things for a living that are interesting, and they explain a little bit about how they do it for a living. Mark Edward, of course, is a telephone psychic. So I was fascinated to learn more about the telephone psychic industry from that book. Not the, he's not going to win any literary prizes for his writing style, but it's still a very interesting book, mostly just because of the subject matter. Next up, How to Read and Why by Harold Bloom. How to Read and Why by Harold Bloom. It's been on my shelf for a long time. Let's just read a little bit off the back here for you. Information is endlessly available to us. Where shall wisdom be found? That's the crucial question with which renowned literary critic Harold Bloom begins this impassioned book on the pleasures and benefits of reading well. And apparently, Harold Bloom's idea of teaching you how to read is to tell you what to read. And, I have no problem with that. I have no problem. In fact, I like lists of books to read. But this is organized into categories. The first section is short stories that he's recommended, like Bezhenty by Ivan Turgenev, The Kiss by Anton Chekhov, Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. He's got a little mini essay about each of these in here. But then there's a section on poems, William Blake, A.E. Housman, Robert Browning, Walt Whitman, John Milton. Then the third section is the one I'm most interested in, because this is the type of fiction that I'm most interested in, novels. And he lists the following novels: Don Quixote, The Charterhouse of Parma, Emma by Jane Austen, Great Expectations, Crime and Punishment, The Portrait of a Lady, In Search of Lost Time, and The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. That alone will keep you busy for quite a while, that list. If nothing else, In Search of Lost Time, take you forever to read. Section 4 is plays, and he's only got 3 plays listed here: Hamlet, Hedda Gabler, and The Importance of Being Earnest. And then he's got novels, part 2, section 5. Herman Melville, Moby Dick. William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying. Nathaniel West, Miss Lonely Hearts. Thomas Pynchon, The Crying of Lot 49. Cormac McCarthy, Blood Meridian. Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. And Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. I haven't read this all the way through. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to read the essays about books that I haven't read yet. But I have read some of the books recommended in here and then followed it up with the essays, and that was pretty fun. So this I did as a buddy read with Criminale over on his channel. This is called Death in the Conjurer by Tom Mead. It's a Joseph Spector locked room mystery. A locked room mystery is a subgenre of the mystery novel where, the murder was impossible. He couldn't have gotten in, he couldn't have gotten out. It was committed in a locked room. So, but anyway, the main character, Joseph Spector, he's sort of the main character. He's like a consulting detective, but it's set in the 1930s, if I remember correctly. Most of the characters are members of the theater. Hey, buddy, how you doing? Say hi to everybody, Brock. There's my boy, Brock Meyer. He's my best friend. I love him. He sticks right by me everywhere I go. But yeah, the main character, Joseph Spector, is a consulting detective who's also has a long-standing career as a stage magician. So, of course, he's suitable to solve locked door mysteries. Okay, so this is another fun one, and this is sort of a history. I had the Avon paperback edition of this, but I don't anymore. I have this big hardcover edition. It's the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, edited by Robert Silverberg, the greatest science fiction stories of all time, chosen by the members of the Science Fiction Writers of America, Volume 1. That's quite a title, isn't it? So anyway, this is a collection of short stories. There were 2 more volumes, 2A and 2B, which were collections of short novels. But some of the more notable short stories in here, for me, my favorite in here was well, heck, where did it go? Microcosmic God by Theodore Sturgeon was my favorite story in here. And it was my favorite when I was growing up, too. There's a story by Frederick Brown in here called Arena, which was later made into an episode of Star Trek. It's the one where Kirk fights the Gorn. So that's a pretty big deal. Nightfall by Isaac Asimov was really good. I'm not going to read all these to you, but there's quite a few good ones. The 9 Billion Names of God by Arthur C. Clarke I thought was really great. It's a Good Life by Jerome Bixby is really good. And then Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes is in here. And it's about 25 pages long. It's the short story version of it. You've probably read the novel that was later made into a movie called Charlie. It was really good too. So anyway, that's a really great one. I'm probably going to get some use out of that for an event coming up called Rocket Summer. Okay, now I've got a big monster of a book here that I'm really excited about showing off. It is called For Keeps, and is written by Pauline Kael. Pauline Kael was the movie critic for the New Yorker magazine for a long time. And she got started fairly late in life. I think she got started there when she was well into her 50s, although it wasn't her first job as a movie critic. But this is over 1,200 pages filled with movie reviews from Pauline Kael. And she's a wonderfully entertaining writer. I do not always or even often agree with her takes on movies. And of course, most of the movies that she's reviewing here are from the 70s, or maybe even some from the 80s. There's Moonstruck, there's Beetlejuice. So those are from the late 80s. The Grifters, Dances with Wolves, Hannah and Her Sisters. Let me give you an idea of what her writing sounds like, though. She's such a terrific writer. I'm just going to pick one of these at random. Batman, page 1202. This would be, of course, the Michael Keaton Batman, the first Batman movie, which was a really, really big deal to me as a callow youth. Finding page 1202 is tricky because it's such a big, thick book. $11.99, 1201. Batman. This is just the first paragraph, okay? In Batman, the movement of the camera gives us the sensation of swerving by radar through the sinister nighttime canyons of Gotham City. We move swiftly among the forbidding, thickly clustered skyscrapers and dart around the girders and pillars of their cave-like underpinnings. This is the brutal city where crime festers, a city of alleys, not avenues. In one of these alleys, Bruce Wayne as a child watched, helpless, as his parents were mugged and senselessly shot down. Now a grown man and fabulously wealthy, Bruce, Michael Keaton, patrols the city from the rooftops. He has developed his physical strength to the utmost and, disguised in body armor, a cowl, and a wide-winged cape, and with the aid of a high-tech arsenal, he scales buildings and swoops down on thugs and mobsters. Batman. So anyway, yeah, she's a good writer, good prose stylist, and she has interesting opinions. Excuse me for a minute. I've got to hydrate for just a second. Forgive me for that. Okay, so the rest of these books all have something in common. This is the shelf where I keep my Robert E. Howard collection. Okay, a lot of y'all probably didn't know I had a Robert E. Howard collection, but I do. And this is the Del Rey collection. And there's a whole mess of these, okay? So the Conan, Robert E. Howard's most famous for creating Conan. That's the Conquering Sword of Conan. This is the Bloody Crown of Conan. And this is the Coming of Conan the Cimmerian. Okay, so these 3 books contain all the Conan stories that were written by Robert E. Howard. It's the whole shebang there. And they're authoritative authoritative editions too. So, I didn't get introduced to Conan the Barbarian in this way. There were a bunch of little paperbacks that I came to Conan through that were edited by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, but they had put the stories not in publication order, but in chronological order from Conan's life. And they had written in some additional stories by Lynn Carter or L. Sprague de Camp that they just inserted in there. It makes for a very different experience because that was not how Howard had intended the Conan books to be read. But at any rate, that's a big mess of reading right there by itself. But it's a far cry from everything that Robert E. Howard wrote. He was really prolific for an author who, I believe he killed himself when he was 29 or 30. He was really young. Okay, but I also have the horror stories of Robert E. Howard, which includes Clay Pigeons. Clay Pigeons, is that the name of it? Or, I got to look it up now. It's a real famous short story, but I may have the name of it wrong. The Haunter of the Ring, The Dead Remember, Worms of the Earth. There's some great titles. And there's a whole mess of stories in this book. A Song of the Werewolf Folk. I don't see anything about pigeons here. The Thing on the Roof. Huh. That's weird. Well, I'm sure that Pigeons from Hell is the name of the story that I'm trying to think of. Not Clay Pigeons. Clay Pigeons is a song by Blaze Foley. Terrific song, but not a horror story by any means. Okay, so that's really cool, the horror stories collection. And then I've also got the Best of Robert E. Howard volumes 1 and 2 here. Forgive me for stretching over here. But volume 1 is called Crimson Shadows. Volume 2 is called Grim Lands. And these are just filled with more short stories. They're big and thick. And one of the things to like about these volumes too is they've got different artwork from different artists. It's really cool. So, but these are pretty thick too. I mean, we're talking 400 pages. You could spend a lot of time just reading nothing but Robert E. Howard. There's the Grimlands cover. It's got a cool pirate on there and stuff. And yeah, and I'm sure, Michael K. Vaughan would agree that that's not a bad way to spend your time if you like pulp fiction, you know what I mean? Brock, you gonna say hi to everybody? Huh? You good boy, ain't you? I love that dog so much. Let's see here. Robert E. Howard, El Borak, and Other Desert Adventures. This would have been good to tap into for our Spring into Adventure event that we had earlier this year. Pretty cool artwork here, though. Thought you might get a kick out of that. I want to say El Borak is a hardened fighter from Texas wandering in the sandscapes of Afghanistan. That's what I want to say. I haven't read any of those, but they sound great. Sword Woman and Other Historical Adventures. Sword Woman and Other Historical Adventures. And let's see here. Some of Howard's most unusual and memorable characters, including Cormac Fitzgeoffrey, a half-Irish, half-Norman man of war, who follows Richard the Lionhearted to 12th century Palestine. And Diego de Guzman, a Spaniard who visits Cairo in the guise of a Muslim. So anyway, more adventure stories, more pulp stories, but those are all historically based. Now this I remember from being a kid. Bran Mac Morn, The Last King. Okay, and I believe Bran Mac Morn is a Pict. This is more historical fiction. But if I understand correctly, at sometime in the past, the Picts ruled all of Europe. It says so right on the back of this. But when I was younger, I did find a mass market paperback that had stories about Bran Mac Morn in them, and it was really terrific. I loved it then. I don't know how I'd feel about it now, but my appreciation of Robert E. Howard has grown over the years rather than lessened, so I probably like it a lot. And, okay, so I've always loved the name of this character, Kull, Exile of Atlantis. Kull, Exile of Atlantis. Heroic tales of adventure from a father of sword and sorcery. So, there's your cover art and stuff. There wasn't nearly as much written about Kull as there was Conan. In fact, Kull was kind of an antecedent or a predecessor of Conan's. But still, there's a number of illustrations in here and quite a few stories. I mean, there's at least a dozen stories in here, including By This Axe I Rule, which was rewritten in another form and became the first Conan story. And finally, okay, this is my favorite Robert E. Howard character, which is gonna much to Steve Donahue's chagrin, The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane. Okay, so I love Solomon Kane. I'm going to read this, okay? He was a strange blending of Puritan and Cavalier, with a touch of the ancient philosopher and more than a touch of the pagan. A hunger in his soul drove him on, an urge to right all wrongs, protect all weaker things. Wayward and restless as the wind, he was consistent in only one respect. He was true to his ideals of justice and right. Such was Solomon Kane. And I always thought that was such a cool name, too, Solomon Kane. But that is the contents of bookshelf number 3 on bookcase number 1. Tomorrow or the next day or whenever I get around to my next one, we will cover bookshelf number 4 from that bookcase, which only had 5 shelves, and the bottom shelves were full of comic books. But mostly those are Star Trek novels on shelf number 4, so you'll want to tune in for that. At any rate, I'm getting a little bit tired now, and I've run out of books on that shelf to talk about for this bookshelf tour. So I'm going to bid you adieu and remind you to stay sexy and stay hydrated.